less than 50% of Australians actually have a plan for retirement. We are so lucky here in Australia to have such an amazing retirement system. I certainly think the retirement system is the envy of many people around the world. Only 40% of Australians were actually able to identify or know when they could actually access their superannuation. Australians have this fear of running out, and therefore they probably are inflating slightly what they are going to need in retirement. How do we get younger Australians to not think of it as something that they'll worry about in 30 years, something that's attached to their employment? How do we get Australians to think of it as an investment in their future and in a successful retirement?
Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates, a podcast where we explore what is possible in the world of investing. If you've just joined us for the very first time, we have a huge episode for you today. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm very good, Bryce. Very excited for this episode. I am excited for every episode. You hear me say it multiple times
I had someone the other day
week.
actually ask me, is Ren genuinely excited for every episode?
Yeah. We get to
of course he is.
We get to do this for a job.
I know.
Like, how could we don't have real jobs.
No.
We sit in a room and talk about a topic
Stuff that
we're
we love.
interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course I'm excited, but I'm particularly excited today because we are talking about a topic that people generally don't think of as exciting.
Yeah.
Superannuation.
Yes.
But we are here to make it exciting. We are here to get Australians excited about it. It is the only free kick in Australian finance. For most Australians, it is either going to be the biggest or the second biggest asset you have at retirement. And yet too many Australians aren't thinking about it. And so September is the time of year where we encourage Australians to check in with their superannuation, get excited about it, and maximize what it can be doing for them. And today we've got an interview focused on that topic.
Yes, we're excited to bring in the big hitters today because we have Managing Director of Vanguard Australia, Daniel Shrimski, who is joining us to talk about the report that Vanguard have been doing now for 3 years called How Australia Retires. They've been surveying Australians to get a sense of sentiment, to get a sense of how we're feeling.
I was going to describe it as we get excited about it and talk about it, they get excited about it and do the work to find out how Australians are feeling about retirement, how Australians are actually retiring, the things that are front of mind for them when it comes to retirement planning. And so we're going to cover a lot of what they found, but we're also going to cover some really practical steps that every Australian can take, regardless of their age, regardless of their super balance, regardless of how close they are to retirement, to optimize their superannuation and get the most out of it.
So a massive thank you goes to Vanguard Super for supporting us through the month of September for Super September, something that we are really passionate about, engaging all Australians and the Equity Mates community. Are you with a low super fund, or are you giving away money on high fees? Because you could retire with what's more of yours tomorrow by lowering your super fees today.
Head to vanguard.com.au/super to explore Vanguard Super. You can also head to vanguard.com.au/super to read the report that we're going to be talking about titled How Australia Retires.
Yes. Products issued by Vanguard Super Proprietary Limited. Consider the PDS and MD at vanguard.com.au/super and decide if it's right for you.
Well, with that said, let's get to our conversation with Daniel Shrimski, Managing Director of Vanguard Australia.
Daniel, welcome to Equity Mates.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So this is Vanguard's third annual How Australia Retires report.
Yep.
Can you tell us what the research looks at and what motivated Vanguard to undertake it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's once again, thanks very much for having us. We look at the superannuation system and think, we are so lucky here in Australia to have such an amazing retirement system, and we have visitors that come over from the US, from other Vanguard offices, and I certainly think the retirement system is the envy of many people around the world. And if you look at the numbers, I think we're the fourth largest retirement system today. I think second largest predicted to be by the end of the decade. So we, very, very lucky. But when we set up Vanguard Super, which was almost 3 years ago, we wanted Vanguard Super to be three things: transparent, low cost, and simple. And we think almost 3 years on, we think we've done well in working towards that. Certainly believe we're achieving that. But we've also learnt that as it relates to retirement, investment returns are certainly part of it, but there's lots more to retirement as it relates to Australians. So we conducted this research, as you said, Bryce, this is the third time we've done it, just to understand how do Australians experience, how do they prepare for, how do they feel about retirement. And it's been really interesting to look at the results, particularly over a 3-year period. And we've gone out, we've interviewed or surveyed, I should say, about 1,800 Australians, different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different age groups. And as I said, it's been really interesting. So just some of the headlines maybe I can share with you, and I'm sure we'll get more into some of the detail. But planning for retirement is something that we've seen a really big gap in as it relates to Australians. So I think less than 50% of Australians actually have a plan for retirement. And that doesn't mean you have to go and see a financial advisor and have a detailed plan, but just something simple that can sort of navigate people through retirement. You know, that's a quite alarming number for us. And then when you have a look at things like financial literacy, we've certainly seen that Australians have, honestly, compared to other parts of the world, quite low levels of financial literacy around retirement. And we ran some questions as part of the survey, some pretty simple questions around things like interest rates, inflation, risk, and 18 to 24-year-olds in particular had very low levels of literacy. They scored, I think, 52% on the test. And then maybe the last point I'll highlight at this moment, if you think about, and it relates to financial literacy, only 40% of Australians were actually able to identify or know when they could actually access their superannuation, which is age 60 right now. So that's alarming for us, but I think it identified gaps, but what it also does is sort of gives us areas that as an industry we need to really lean into, and we can help Australians have better retirement. So it gives you a little bit of a summary of where we've come from, and again, things that we'll no doubt dive into a little bit more today.
Yeah, I mean, some of those numbers are so fascinating. We're going to dig into a lot of them, but it's just a reminder of how important it is to engage with your finances and engage with your super. And we want to start by getting away from the hard numbers and talking about how Australians feel, because sadly, Australians aren't feeling too good, particularly working Australians. Well, your research found that only 43% of working age Australians have positive feelings about retirement. So the majority don't have positive feelings. And yet 65% of actual retirees do have positive feelings about retirement. So how do you explain this sentiment gap? And I guess why are working Australians so pessimistic?
Yeah.
Because they're still working.
Yeah, true.
They're still working. Well, that's right. I mean, I think it was interesting. The whole sentiment piece was fascinating for us because what we also saw was women have more negative sentiment as it relates to retirement than men. And that's, I think, another topic altogether that we can talk about at another time. But, you know, we certainly have seen women just with less investment confidence than men. And that's something that we need to tackle as an industry. Likewise, as you say, Alec, from an age standpoint, sentiment actually improves as you get older. And we think it has to do with the fact that home ownership is such an important part of retirement, something we'll talk a little bit more about today, I'm sure. But home ownership is more likely as you get older, and retirees have higher levels of home ownership than younger Australians. I think just general wealth is higher among retirees than it is working age Australians. And working age Australians, I think, have more debt than retirees. So I think that certainly impacts sentiment, but also, you know, we have learned through the research that younger Australians are stressed by the thought of talking about retirement, preparing for retirement. It is quite daunting for them. So look, again, probably somewhat intuitive in terms of those results, but as you dig a little deeper, it's really interesting to understand how, what it's telling us. I think for us, one of the biggest things that we think comes out of the research is that Australians, and you mentioned it just then, Alec, Australians need to really engage with their superannuation. They need to think of it as an investment in their future. But right now I feel like, as an industry, we've got work to do in that regard because it is something that younger Australians in particular really lean out from.
Yeah, we wanted to start with sentiment because it's like you need the light at the end of the tunnel. You need to feel hopeful or aspirational to then actually want to engage and feel like there is value in engaging with your super. And if you don't have positive feelings about retirement, then it becomes too hard or too scary or too anxiety inducing.
Exactly.
So What did your research find around some of like the impacts of this sentiment from young Australians?
I think it's about trying to find the right balance. Like, there's a little bit of anxiety is probably not such a bad thing in terms of it potentially being the catalyst that can get Australians to actually really lean in. You know, I don't think the negative sentiment is necessarily harmful, but I think it certainly is causing stress, and that stress is meaning that younger Australians are just ignoring it and thinking, hey, I'll worry about that later on. But I think a little bit of anxiety might be the catalyst Australians need. But I'll just double down on the point I made. Again, you know, we see so many people come through our business and they say, I wish I had leaned in at an earlier age. I wish I had started thinking about this when I was in my 30s or 40s, not when I'm in my 50s and 60s. And, you know, by example, the difference between a low-cost superannuation fund and an average-cost superannuation fund is about 50 basis points. And for the average Australian worker, that can mean $100,000 come retirement, and that's material. And obviously, if you earn more than the average Australian worker, it's more than $100,000. So again, I just double down on the point. Australians really need to focus on it, and whilst it does cause some level of anxiety, I think you need to, we'll get into financial literacy, just become closer to what we believe is a real investment in your retirement.
Well, that's what Super September is all about here at
Yep.
Equity Mates, engaging Australians in their superannuation fund. So, Daniel, let's turn to expectations around superannuation. The research shows Australians under 45 believe they'll need about $100,000 a year in retirement, nearly double the $55,000 that current retirees are actually spending. So it's a pretty big disconnect.
Yeah.
Is that showing that young Australians are being unrealistic? Is it showing that we're going to face a more expensive retirement, or are we just nailing the concept of inflation?
Yeah, I think it's good question. I think it's a combination of probably all three. I mean, we certainly think that there is a little bit of an overestimation there, and I just think it probably goes back to the point that we were just discussing. There is a disconnect in terms of disconnect to their super. So I think that naturally causes a bit of an overestimation around what people think they will need. But yeah, no doubt at all, the cost of living increase that Australians have experienced over the last few years is real. And I think a lot of Australians think that's just going to continue. So I will need more in retirement. But I think the biggest part is probably this anxiety and uncertainty. And this, we talked about it a lot in last year's report, 4.0, fear of running out. I think Australians have this fear of running out, and therefore they probably are inflating slightly what they are going to need in retirement. So look, I think, again, it goes back to the point. Again, if you start to think about what you're going to need in retirement, how long you're going to be retired for, it will probably you'll probably start to circle in on what the right number is as it relates to what you're going to need. But yeah, I think it was quite alarming given the difference between what retirees have today or feel like need today and what working age Australians think they will need. But I think it's probably a combination of all those things.
Now, the great thing is you guys are doing this report every year, and so you're now starting to build a body of data that you can see change over time. And what you found was particularly for young people in that 25 to 34 age bracket, there has been a sharp increase, even in just the 3 years, in what they expect to need at retirement. So what do you put that down to?
Yeah, I think to your point, it's if we go back to the numbers, I think for 25 to 34-year-olds, in 2023, they thought they'd need 66,000. 96,000 in 2024 and now 106,000 for that. So a really big increase. And again, what we think it is a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. It's the uncertainty, anxiety factor that is just driving that up. But even if those numbers are wrong, to your point, Alec, it's a trend. It's almost a bit of a temperature check on how Australians are feeling. So whether it's right or wrong number, they are feeling as though they're going to need a lot more when compared to 2023, so 2 years ago. So I think it's something that, again, we need to stand up, take note of, and work out how as an industry we can help Australians, prepare and make sure that they can live that dignified retirement they've worked hard for. But it is alarming.
Yeah.
One of the sort of big assumptions that is baked into the numbers that the industry sort of puts out when it comes to how much you need when you retire is the fact that you own your own home.
Yes.
1 in 3 millennials expect to retire with a mortgage, compared to, I think, 8% of current retirees who actually have one, based on the report. So is the system or is that assumption now fundamentally broken? How are you guys thinking about this?
Yeah, it's such an interesting one, housing. So I completely agree. I think retirement has always, a lot of it has always been about, do I own my home? That's such a huge part of an Australian's retirement. And I do think the landscape is changing. If you go back to the 90s, the late 90s, I think 90% of Australians owned their home outright. And Bryce, you just mentioned it. Today, I think 2/3 of Australian retirees own their home outright, 8% have mortgages, and then there are obviously a bunch of renters, which is another issue altogether. You touched on it, Bryce. 1 in 4 millennials think they're going to have a mortgage. 1 in 3 millennials, 1 in 4 baby boomers anticipate having a mortgage in retirement. And we're not surprised by that. If you think of the average age of a first homeowner is late 30s today. So if you then think of a 25-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage, that takes Australians into their 60s and 70s. And therefore, Australians are going to take mortgages into retirement. And I think that is a changing assumption. It's a changing landscape versus where we were in the 90s and before. So, that's concerning in terms of Australians living that dignified retirement that they've worked hard for.
It might be why millennials have gone from 66,000 to 106,000, because they think they're going to be servicing a mortgage in retirement.
Yeah. I mean, we obviously, if people are, want financial advice, they should seek personal advice and think about how it meets their needs and the time. But I think just generally, like, using superannuation to grow your nest egg as big as possible, using the tax advantage system is really the best thing you can do to prepare for whatever the eventualities when it comes to housing, because that 15 or 17 or whatever it is percent tax benefit it will set you up better than if you don't take advantage of it. Yeah,
it's interesting. So I think traditional or historically, those retirement income models have factored in no mortgage, no rent come retirement. You'll own your home outright, and retirement income is sort of not going to factor in those things. Well, just based on the numbers that we talked about, those historical models are going to need to change, because for those Australians taking a mortgage into retirement, I think 50% of them will just continue, are saying through the research, they will continue to just make payments in their retirement to pay down their mortgage. About 25% of them are saying they'll use their super to make a lump sum payment to pay down the mortgage in its entirety. That's really interesting to have that understanding of how Australians think about it, but that's going to mean a very, very different set of assumptions come planning for one's retirement. And as you plan for your retirement, you need to be factoring that in. So if you use your super to pay down your mortgage, okay, well, what do you have? What's left over for you to live that dignified retirement that you've worked hard for? So again, as we sort of think about retirement income modeling, those assumptions need to be built in.
Yeah.
So Daniel, in the report, you had a persona, Sam, where you identified 5 key actions that people can take to feel more positive and confident about super. Because a lot of what we just went through was certainly sort of painting, particularly for younger people, not a very confident outlook on retirement. So can you just talk us through high level what the 5 key actions are?
Yeah, and I think Bryce, it's a good point. There are some really interesting findings that come out of the research that we've talked about so far, but there are things that Australians can do. There are things that Australians can do to enable them or to make their retirement more, more what they're looking for, what they're hoping for, what they've worked hard for. And those 5 things for us, firstly, would be to prepare a retirement plan. And it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be with a financial advisor, but building a retirement plan that takes into consideration how long you anticipate working for, how long you anticipate being in retirement for, what sort of lifestyle you want to live in retirement, what sort of hobbies you have, those kinds of things, building them into a retirement plan is going to be important. Do you have a partner? Are they working? Those kinds of things. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be, crazy levels of granularity. But that is a really important part of preparing for retirement. The second element would be building greater financial literacy. I talked at the outset around the fact that Australians' financial literacy around investments and superannuation is not at the level we think it should be. But gaining an understanding of things like compounding and interest rates and diversification are things that, again, we think Australians will be better off once they understand those things. The third one would be improving your understanding of the superannuation and retirement system. We talked about the fact that Australians don't know when they can access their super, but just understanding that and other high-level details associated with the Australian retirement system we think is important. The fourth is making voluntary contributions to your superannuation if you can. Alec, you talked about some of the tax benefits. Again, by no means advice, but we do believe that making voluntary contributions is an important part of building that nest egg. And the last is to engage with your superannuation a couple of times a year. And that doesn't mean you need to get on the call and get on the phone. It could just be jumping online and having a look at your superannuation. And we can delve into that a little bit more maybe. But so they're the five. The last one that we haven't touched on yet, and I think it is important, financial advice. Again, where affordability and accessibility exists, financial advice we think is very important in terms of guiding Australians to a successful retirement. And when we look at retirement confidence, if you have a financial advisor, I think it's about 2x the retirement confidence than someone who doesn't have a financial advisor. So there is real value in financial advice, but again, as an industry, we need to solve some of the accessibility and affordability issues that I'm sure you guys are aware of and have talked about. So they're the things that we think about, Bryce. And again, I think they're tangible things that Australians can do to improve their likelihood of retirement success.
And nothing too complicated there. I don't think anything there is overwhelming.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, we want to turn to some practical steps that Australians can do that sort of align with those five steps there. And I think let's start with engaging because that's what Super September is all about. It's about taking that time to engage with your super, making sure things are right, you're in the right investment options, your fund is performing, your fees are low, all of that stuff. The sad thing is that the majority of Australians aren't engaging. Your research found that 56% of Australians engage with their super fund less than once per year.
Yeah.
So rather than dwelling on what people aren't doing, let's focus on what people can and should be doing.
Yeah.
What does good engagement look like? What should all Australians have as sort of a little, I guess, like a checklist to say, if I do this, I'm ticking that engagement box?
Yeah, it's a great one, Alex. So the first, I touched on it, I think it was point 5, engaging with your super fund a couple of times a year, at least, is what we think is going to put Australians in a better position. And when engaging, as I said, doesn't necessarily mean you pick up the phone and call and have a chat with someone on the other end of the line. It could be, we think it's jumping online and becoming more familiar with your superannuation. What investments are you in? What fees are you paying? What does your insurance look like? They're just really simple, fundamental elements of your superannuation that you should be familiar with. And you should hopefully be able to make a decision. Does that meet my needs? Does that align with where I'm heading in my retirement? Annual statements for superannuation funds come out in August, September. Spending 15, 20 minutes actually going through the annual statement and understanding what's being deducted and what, again, your insurance looks like, we think they are important elements of Australians engaging with the superannuation. So they're really, really simple things, but ultimately Australians need to make sure that they're in a fund that best meets their needs, that their investments are, they're taking on the risk that meets their needs, again, that works for them, given where they're at in life and given what they want to achieve and what their retirement goals are. And again, fees. We think performance is really important, but fees are also very important. Are you paying fees that, again, it's not about low cost for everyone. Some people want exposure to asset classes that mean you do need to pay more fees, but are the fees commensurate for what you are actually getting? So I think it's, again, engaging can be really simple, but just building that acumen, becoming more familiar with what you've got, and taking more ownership of your retirement is something, we're passionate about.
And when people are checking and just looking at their dollar figure amount, are there any specifics that they should be checking beyond just how much it's gone up or down?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's also, are the right amounts being deducted? Like, can you see it all coming out? Does that make sense? Does that align? Do you understand why it is that amount? I think that's just basic hygiene, I would say. And understanding your insurance, Bryce, I think is a really important one. Insurance is such a critical part of superannuation. And if you're unsure, I talked about jumping online, you should pick up the phone and call the super fund and make inquiries. And again, that's another way of engaging. But I think just, starting to familiarize yourself is important. And then, do you have multiple superannuation accounts? Maybe you have good reason for doing so, but multiple superannuation accounts mean you're paying different sets of fees that you don't necessarily need to pay if you've got everything consolidated in one fund. So understanding what you have out there, and the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, has ways of locating your super across different funds. And again, people should engage with that and make sure that ideally they're consolidated in one fund and therefore they're minimising fees.
We did a live walkthrough of how to consolidate your super fund. That's the type of content we do here at Equity Mates. And the ATO cannot make it easier.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the ATO have done a phenomenal job of making it easy for Australians to switch. And it's an interesting one, Bryce, because I think people think switching superannuation is like switching home loans or medical insurance providers. Yeah. It's actually one really button. Simple, and credit to the ATO of making it so seamless.
Yeah, big time, big time.
Let's talk fees, but I think just focusing on that point of how people, I guess, perceive it as being quite difficult to change or to check things, and the government have full credit to them. They've done a lot to try and make comparison as easy as possible and to consolidating as easy as possible. But there was some stats in your report that we found interesting. When it came to fees, 34% of Australians have never reviewed or compared super fees, which is concerning. But 59% of Australians who have tried found it difficult to compare fees. So help us understand how we can, I guess, easily compare fees and make sure we're not overpaying.
I wish it was easier than what it is. We have invested a lot of time in trying to understand superannuation fees, and is the transparency out there that ought to be out there for Australians to, as you say, Alec, compare across funds in a way where everyone presents their fees consistently. So it's not easy at all. There are up to 6 different types of fees that Australians are paying on their superannuation. You mentioned some stats there, Alec. One more that I'd mention. Over 60% of Australians are confused by the fees they pay and couldn't explain it if asked.
Yeah, right.
Again, that it should not be that difficult. Again, I sort of made the point earlier, performance is very, very important, but fees are also very important. And one of the things that we have talked about over the last decade, Australian superannuation funds have increased significantly. We've had such a great run on equities, 9% over the last decade on Australian equities, 15% on US equities. We don't believe the next decade is going to be as strong as it relates to equity performance. Our projections are more muted than that. Fees are going to be a more important part of one's superannuation. They're going to play a bigger role in terms of where your balance goes. Therefore, Australians should be able to compare like with like. And we want Australians to engage in their superannuation. But if you don't understand the fees you're paying and you've got to mine through PDSs and be a finance scholar to understand those PDSs, Australians just disengage. So it is a problem. So we have called on the government, we've called on the regulator to make changes that would enable Australians to better compare, to understand what they're paying. And things like low cost. I'll give you an example. So most superannuation funds call themselves low cost. Well, that's impossible. Not all super funds can be low cost. It just doesn't work like that. So what does low cost truly mean? Look, another way in which I think the government can help Australians is more investment in your super comparison tool, which is a great tool that the government's created. But I think investing in that tool and raising awareness of that tool so Australians actually know where to go, because I don't think that tool's getting the usage that it ought to. So again, I think there are things that can be done, but we think right now where we are, there isn't the transparency in the system that there ought to be.
So Daniel, you mentioned financial advice being one of the sort of the key ways in which, or getting financial advice being one of the key ways in which we can feel more confident about our retirement. But there is an advice gap. I think the report shows only 27% of Australians have ever received financial advice. We know the barriers, mainly the cost of getting advice. So what role does super play? And do you see any sort of regulatory changes coming down that might help alleviate this?
We at Vanguard work with 70% of financial advisors in the country. So, it's a very important part of our business and a very important part of financial services in Australia. Australians who get financial advice are more confident in retirement and are more likely to have a successful retirement. So, totally agree, Bryce. The more Australians that can access financial advice in some shape or form, the better. We believe that financial advice, it should be the whole spectrum. So not all Australians need full service financial advice. Some just need guidance around asset allocation. Some just need a nudge. So when we talk about the full spectrum, from education to nudges to personalised guidance, we think technology-enabled advice has a role, and then all the way to full-service financial advice. So we are advocating for the whole spectrum of advice to be available to Australians. And then also, when advice is given, superannuation is obviously a huge part of Australians' wealth, but we also think advice should be given on whole of wealth. So in super, outside of super, it's really important that all elements of one's household wealth are considered when advice is given. So to specifically answer your question, yes, we think superannuation funds should be able to give advice, but not full service comprehensive financial advice that financial advisors are offering. We think there should be guardrails and particular settings that enable superannuation funds to give advice and what we would call sort of small A advice in comparison to big A advice for full service financial advisors. And I think that would enable more Australians to be served, more Australians to be given simple advice like, how much, what the concessional cap is and whether they should contribute more so that they get to the concessional cap, or basic things around diversification. So I think there is a role for superannuation funds to play, and we're certainly advocating for that. But again, we don't feel as though that substitutes anything that financial advisors are doing. It just enables more Australians to be served.
So we want to close with some questions, I guess, looking forward. And, we've spoken a little bit about policy. And so we want you to put your policy hat on for this one. If you were Prime Minister for a day, or if you could wave a magic wand, and let's say you could we'll give you 3 big changes to improve retirement outcomes for Australians.
Yeah.
What would they be?
Yeah, that's a great one. Look, the first one, just maybe carrying on from where I was, I think financial advice in Australia just needs to be so much more accessible. 10% of Australians receive financial advice. In the US, it's 60%.
I mean, to speak to the advice gap in our audience, we survey people every year. 74% of our audience said they think they would benefit from advice, but only 12% of our audience have been able to access advice.
Yeah, that speaks volumes. Yeah. So enabling more Australians to access financial advice will absolutely enable more superior financial outcomes in retirement. So number one. Number two, I think we need to find a way to get Australians to engage more in their super. I think we've talked about it a lot today, but how do we get younger Australians to not think of it as something that they'll worry about in 30 years, something that's attached to their employment? how do we get Australians to think of it as an investment in their future and in a successful retirement? So I think that would be the second one. And the third one, I think, would be around transparency on fees. Again, fees are an important part of the equation. They're going to become an increasingly important part, we believe, over the next 10 years. And again, greater transparency and enabling Australians to understand what they're getting and what they're paying for, I think is also going to be very important.
I love that second one around getting young people to engage. Bryce and I have set the mission. About 2/3 of Australians own a house, either with a mortgage or without a mortgage, and Australians are obsessed with housing. We all know that. Whereas every working Australian has super and is invested in, the stock market and other assets, and yet they don't think about it.
Yeah, they
So
don't.
we will know that the Equity Mates journey is complete when Australians are obsessed with the stock market as they are with housing.
Yeah. Well, the other interesting one, just talking about, exactly. The other interesting one on home ownership. I mean, you talk about 66, 68%.
Yeah, it's about a third, I think, roughly is.
But I mean, every one of them would know what their mortgage rate is.
Yeah,
And
true.
they would be all over that with intimate detail.
Yeah.
Can they get a better deal over here? Can they get a better deal over there? Now, superannuation's different. Totally get that. But superannuation, people wouldn't know what they're paying with superannuation. And if they thought of it in a similar way, I think they would be better off.
Yeah. So Daniel, 5 years from now, 2030, when you're writing you personally won't be writing it, but when Vanguard is
Never know.
preparing the How Australia Retires report, what are the key trends that you'll be sort of keeping a close eye on?
It's a great question. I mean, I think housing will be one for sure. I get concerned a little bit by hearing that, again, 1 in 3 millennials are going to take a mortgage into retirement. I think housing is one we will be watching really closely in terms of home ownership, mortgages, the amount of Australians renting. So that would be the first one that I think is going to be extremely important and obviously very topical in Australia and with government and policymakers. The second one is probably financial literacy. I think as a nation, we need to work hard at improving literacy amongst all Australians, particularly younger Australians. I've got a son in year 12, and the curriculum, I don't believe, is what it needs to be in order to set younger Australians up for a future where they understand some of the real basics around investing, superannuation, and just things that I think will set them up in like budgeting.
Yeah.
So I do think that financial literacy, we can't ignore it. It's been an issue for way, way too long. I am hoping that as an industry, policymakers, regulators, there is work to be done at getting us to a better place. But I do believe industry and Vanguard being part of that industry, we have a role to play in improving financial literacy as well. But I would like to see, getting back to your question, Bryce, in 2030, a real improvement in that.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. So let's circle back to where we started to close this out, which is sentiment, and particularly sentiment among working and young Australians. You're speaking to a large cohort of those people today. What would you leave them with? What words would you leave young Australians with to maybe encourage them to think about their retirement and to sort of see it as a positive light at the end of the tunnel?
It's a great question, Alec. I would say don't be scared by the thought of engaging in something that might be 30 years out. You will benefit from engaging early and treating superannuation as something that is yours and as something that is an investment in your future. So do the work, which, there are practical steps there. Do the work that is not onerous to set yourself up for a brighter future.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to Vanguard for supporting our efforts here at Equity Mates for Super September as we try and engage our community and Australians to engage with their super fund. We'll include a link to the report in our show notes, and you can head to vanguard.com.au/super to explore Vanguard Super. But thank you so much for your time today, Daniel. We really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Thank you, and a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Daniel.
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful. Equity.